They were moving in broad daylight, on an open highway, protected by modern air defenses. Nothing about this convoy suggested danger. No alarms, no urgency, no reason to believe anything was wrong. And yet, within minutes, everything they trusted collapsed. What happened next wasn't just unexpected. It defied military logic, broke long-standing assumptions, and forced commanders to question what safe really means. Many would later say this kind of strike should have been impossible, until the footage emerged. Daylight is normally treated as an operational liability in contested airspace, a time when aircraft are exposed, visible, and vulnerable to layered air defenses. In this strike, however, daylight was deliberately weaponized, not for visibility, but for psychology. Russian doctrine strongly associates clear weather with control. When skies are open and sensors are unobstructed, commanders tend to believe the battle space is stable and predictable. That assumption shaped every decision the convoy made. Vehicles stayed tightly grouped, spacing was optimized for speed rather than survivability, and movement followed a fixed route instead of dispersed or staggered patterns. In short, confidence replaced caution. The presence of air defense systems reinforced that mindset. With Pantsir units positioned at the front and rear, the convoy commander believed risk had been mathematically reduced, turning daylight from a threat into a perceived shield. This psychological comfort mattered more than the hardware itself. Ukraine exploited this mental state with precision. By striking in broad daylight, the attack violated expectations so deeply that it delayed reaction. Crews were conditioned to associate daylight with safety and night with danger. When the jet appeared under clear skies, the shock alone consumed precious seconds. That hesitation translated directly into vulnerability. The convoy did not immediately scatter, shut down engines, or abandon the road. Instead, it froze, caught between doctrine and reality. Visibility, which should have aided defense, became a trap. Everything was exposed at once: vehicle layout, air defense placement, fuel trucks, and command elements. There was nowhere to hide and no ambiguity about what was being targeted. This inversion of logic is the core lesson. Daylight did not protect the convoy. It removed uncertainty for the attacker while amplifying complacency in the defender. Ukraine demonstrated that psychological conditioning can be more exploitable than technical limitations. By choosing a time when the enemy felt safest, the strike attacked not just vehicles, but assumptions. In modern warfare, the most dangerous moment is often when a force believes it is secure, and daylight, in this case, became the trigger for that fatal belief. What ultimately decided this strike was not the destructive power of missiles or rockets, but the way intelligence was compressed into time. Ukrainian surveillance assets had been tracking the convoy for hours, collecting data that, on its own, changed nothing. The critical transformation occurred when that information was distilled into a narrow decision window, 35 minutes before the convoy reached cover and became operationally untouchable. In modern warfare, information only becomes power when it is synchronized with opportunity, and in this case, timing was more valuable than numbers. Every data point, speed, route, vehicle spacing, air defense placement was fused into a single, coherent picture that demanded immediate action. There was no room for iterative planning or layered force deployment. The intelligence did not support a large strike package. It enabled a single aircraft to act with disproportionate effect. This kind of intelligence compression reflects a broader shift in how wars are fought. Rather than accumulating overwhelming force, Ukraine focused on collapsing the decision cycle. The convoy was not destroyed because it was weak, but because it was momentarily exposed. Terrain analysis showed where radar coverage thinned, route prediction identified where the vehicles would be most constrained, and air defense identification revealed which elements had to be neutralized first. All of this was processed in real time, turning hours of observation into seconds of execution. The jet did not simply respond to intelligence, it embodied it. The aircraft became the final node in a long chain of sensing, analysis, and decision-making. Some will view this approach as recklessly dependent on perfect timing, arguing that a single delay or miscalculation could have ended in disaster. Others may counter that it was the only viable option in an environment where massed air power is impossible and hesitation is fatal. What cannot be disputed is that this operation demonstrates how modern combat increasingly rewards those who can think fastest, not those who can hit hardest. As battlefields become more transparent and contested, the compression of intelligence into decisive moments may matter more than any individual weapon system. How convincing do you find this model of warfare? And do you believe it is sustainable in the long run? Feel free to share your perspective in the comments. What made this strike strategically decisive was not the number of vehicles destroyed, but the way the convoy was understood and attacked as a single, interdependent system. Rather than viewing it as a line of separate trucks and armored vehicles, Ukrainian planners treated the convoy as a living structure, with critical functions, protection, mobility, and sustainment. Once that perspective is adopted, the logic of the attack becomes clear. The first priority was not the most numerous targets, but the most essential ones. By neutralizing the air defense vehicles at the front and rear, the convoy's protective nervous system was severed. In seconds, the entire formation shifted from a defended column into a vulnerable mass, unable to sense or respond coherently to the threat. With protection removed, the strike shifted to inducing cascading failure rather than maximizing immediate destruction. Fuel and ammunition vehicles were not just high-value assets, they were force multipliers whose loss would amplify damage far beyond their own destruction. A single fuel truck ignited nearby vehicles, turning proximity into liability. An ammunition carrier detonated with enough force to crater the road and disrupt everything around it. These secondary effects mattered more than direct hits, because they converted the convoy's density and speed normally advantages into sources of chaos and self-inflicted damage. Equally important was the decision to treat the road itself as a target. By blocking the highway with wreckage, fires, and craters, the strike achieved something more enduring than a high kill count. Vehicles that were not destroyed became trapped. Intact trucks were rendered useless, abandoned not because they were damaged, but because they could no longer move. Recovery efforts were delayed, exposed, and ultimately abandoned under the threat of follow-on strikes. In operational terms, the convoy ceased to exist the moment the road became impassable. This systems-based approach reveals a deeper shift in modern warfare. Victory is no longer measured solely by how much you destroy, but by how effectively you disrupt function. The convoy did not fail because every vehicle was eliminated. It failed because its internal dependencies were exploited. When protection, sustainment, and mobility collapse together, even surviving assets lose all military value. The defining vulnerability of the Russian air defenses in this engagement was not a lack of range or firepower, but the time it took for those systems to think, decide, and react. Weapons like the Pantsir are designed to be deadly once fully engaged, operating under the assumption that threats will appear at predictable distances and altitudes, allowing radar tracking, target classification, and missile launch to occur in sequence. The Ukrainian attack was engineered specifically to break that sequence. Instead of attempting to outrange the system, the pilot chose to outrun its decision cycle, turning time itself into the battlefield. The sudden pop-up maneuver was central to this logic. Flying at extremely low altitude, the aircraft remained hidden within radar ground clutter until the last possible moment. When it climbed sharply, the jet did not merely reveal itself, it forced every defensive process to begin simultaneously. Radar detection, threat identification, crew confirmation, and weapon assignment all had to occur in seconds. This compressed timeline overwhelmed human operators who, despite automation, still play a decisive role in authorizing and managing engagement. In that narrow window, hesitation was fatal. The air defense systems were technically capable, but temporally unprepared. What followed illustrates a critical imbalance between modern weapons and human cognition. Pantsir crews had only moments to react to incoming laser-guided missiles, moments that vanished as countermeasures filled the radar picture with false returns. By the time the systems attempted interception, their responses were already chasing the past. The defenses were not defeated because they were inaccurate or poorly designed, but because they were forced to operate outside the time envelope for which they were optimized. This encounter exposes a broader truth about contemporary warfare. Maximum capability matters less than usable capability under pressure. A system that can engage at long range is irrelevant if it cannot decide fast enough when that range collapses. Speed of perception, decision, and action increasingly outweighs raw performance specifications. In this strike, the Ukrainian pilot did not overpower the air defenses. He outpaced them. The engagement was won in seconds, not kilometers, demonstrating that in modern air combat, the side that moves faster through the decision loop often prevails over the side with superior technical reach. The success of the strike highlighted a quiet but profound mismatch between how the Russian air defense system was designed to fight and the type of threat it actually faced. Pantsir platforms are built around the assumption that incoming dangers will announce themselves through radar signatures or infrared heat, triggering a familiar cycle of detection, tracking, and interception. Laser-guided munitions fall outside that expectation. They do not emit signals that can be jammed, spoofed, or seduced in the traditional sense. Instead, they follow an invisible line of energy that defensive electronics cannot meaningfully interact with. In this engagement, that design gap was exploited with precision. When the Pantsir systems responded, they did exactly what they were built to do. Interceptor missiles were launched, cannons opened fire, and countermeasures were deployed to confuse radar-guided threats. Chaff created large, convincing false targets that pulled defensive fire away from the aircraft. Against radar-seeking interceptors, this worked as intended. Yet the attacking missiles were never listening to the electronic environment. Guided by laser designation, they were indifferent to noise, deception, and electronic clutter. The defensive response and the offensive guidance simply operated on different planes, barely intersecting at all. This moment reveals a deeper challenge facing modern integrated air defenses. Multi-spectrum systems are often optimized based on statistical expectations of the most common threats, not the most dangerous combinations. In trying to defend against everything, they risk assuming the wrong thing at the wrong moment. The Pantsir did not fail because it lacked sophistication, but because its sophistication was misaligned with the attack it encountered. Its countermeasures fought a battle that was not actually happening. There is no single correct interpretation here. Some analysts might argue this was a niche success unlikely to scale, while others may see it as evidence of a growing vulnerability in systems that rely too heavily on electronic dominance. Different professionals would likely view this moment in very different ways. What is clear, however, is that when defensive assumptions lag behind offensive adaptation, even advanced systems can be rendered briefly but decisively irrelevant. The use of unguided rockets in this strike challenges the common assumption that effectiveness in modern warfare depends almost entirely on precision. Rather than being fired indiscriminately, the rockets were employed with a clear operational logic focused on denial, disruption, and shock. The pilot did not aim to surgically destroy individual vehicles. Instead, the salvo was deliberately spread along the full length of the convoy, transforming a narrow stretch of highway into a temporary kill zone. This distribution mattered more than accuracy. By saturating the area, the attack overwhelmed the convoy's ability to react, maneuver, or regroup, achieving results that precision strikes alone could not have produced as quickly. The physical effects of the rockets extended far beyond direct hits. Near-miss detonations generated intense overpressure, capable of flipping lighter vehicles, collapsing suspensions, and damaging optics and communications equipment. Electronics failed not because they were struck, but because shockwaves and heat-overwhelmed systems never designed to endure such conditions. Even armored vehicles that remained structurally intact were often rendered combat ineffective. Crews abandoned vehicles that could no longer move, see, or communicate, turning functional assets into liabilities in seconds. In this context, destruction was only one outcome. Disorganization and immobilization were equally valuable. This approach reframes the role of so-called dumb weapons. Unguided rockets are often dismissed as outdated or inefficient, yet when used intelligently, they offer a cost-effective method of area denial. Their strength lies in volume, speed, and psychological impact rather than pinpoint accuracy. Each rocket forced defenders to contend with multiple threats simultaneously, increasing stress, reducing decision quality, and accelerating collapse. The visual effect alone, dozens of smoke trails descending at once, created a sense of inevitability that further degraded coordinated response. By prioritizing area control over individual kills, the strike demonstrated a pragmatic understanding of modern battlefields. Roads, formations, and tempo can be more decisive than the destruction of any single target. In that light, unguided rockets were not a compromise born of limited technology, but a deliberate choice. When applied with timing, spacing, and intent, they became a blunt yet highly effective tool for shutting down movement and breaking cohesion at minimal cost. One of the most overlooked aspects of this strike is how completely the aircraft's survival depended on the terrain beneath it. The jet was not simply operating in the landscape, it was using the landscape as an active component of its defense. By maintaining sustained flight at roughly 150 meters, the pilot placed the aircraft in the most hostile environment for enemy radar, where ground clutter, trees, buildings, and terrain features blur returns and break clean tracking solutions. At that altitude, the jet did not need stealth technology. It borrowed concealment from the Earth itself, disappearing into the noise of the battle space until the last possible moment. Valleys, ridgelines, and tree lines effectively became extensions of the aircraft's electronic warfare suite. Each fold in the terrain disrupted line of sight, forcing air defense radars to constantly reacquire the target. Every time the jet slipped behind a hill or into a shallow depression, radar locks weakened or collapsed entirely. This was not passive flying. It was an active, continuous negotiation with the terrain, demanding precise control, constant awareness, and near-perfect execution. At speeds approaching 700 kilometers per hour, a minor miscalculation would have been fatal, yet the alternative, climbing into clean radar space, would have been equally deadly. What emerges from this is a reminder that geography remains one of the most powerful force multipliers in modern warfare. While advanced sensors and missiles dominate theoretical discussions, their effectiveness is sharply constrained by the physical world. Mountains, forests, and valleys still shape what can be seen, tracked, and engaged. In this case, the aircraft's survivability was not defined by superior avionics or countermeasures, but by an intimate understanding of how terrain interacts with radar physics. This approach also highlights a stark asymmetry. Defensive systems are expensive, complex, and technologically sophisticated, yet they remain bound by line of sight and environmental limitations. A comparatively simple aircraft, flown with skill and discipline, can exploit those limits repeatedly. The jet survived not because it was invisible, but because it was where the enemy could not look continuously. Geography, not technology, provided the margin of survival, and in this mission, that margin made all the difference. The escape phase of the mission underscored a harsh reality of modern air combat. Survival is rarely absolute. It is statistical. The pilot did not defeat the missiles by making the aircraft untouchable, but by reducing the probability that any single missile would achieve a lethal solution. Chaff, flares, and electronic jamming were deployed simultaneously, not as guarantees, but as competing signals designed to overwhelm the missile's guidance logic. Each countermeasure introduced doubt, forcing the weapon to choose between multiple imperfect targets. The goal was not to cancel the threat, but to make the missile uncertain long enough for time and distance to intervene. This distinction is critical. Defensive countermeasures do not create safety, they create ambiguity. In this case, that ambiguity was enough, but only barely. One missile detonated roughly 100 meters behind the aircraft, close enough for shrapnel to tear into the tail and damage control systems. That distance is not a margin of comfort. It is a margin of survival measured in fractions of a second. A slightly different angle, a minor delay in deployment, or a more favorable intercept geometry could have produced a fatal outcome. The aircraft lived not because the system worked perfectly, but because it worked just well enough. What this reveals is a broader shift in how air combat is fought. Engagements are no longer binary contests of hit or miss, success or failure. Instead, they are probability games played at extreme speed, where pilots manage risk dynamically in real time. Every maneuver, every countermeasure release subtly shifts the odds. Survival becomes an exercise in stacking small advantages, terrain masking, timing, signal confusion, until the cumulative probability favors escape. This probabilistic reality places enormous demands on pilots. There is no moment when the threat is truly gone, only moments when it becomes less likely to succeed. Even after a missile loses lock, inertia can carry it dangerously close. The explosion behind the aircraft is a stark reminder that modern defenses do not fail cleanly. They fail gradually, unpredictably. In this environment, success is defined not by certainty, but by managing chaos well enough to live through it. The most consequential effects of this strike were not visible in the fireball moments captured on video, but in the quiet days that followed. Tactically, the destruction of vehicles was significant, yet it was the logistical disruption that reshaped the battlefield. Ammunition trucks and fuel carriers were not merely supplies in transit. They represented time, momentum, and operational continuity. When those assets were destroyed or immobilized, Russian units downstream were suddenly operating on borrowed hours. Planned offensives stalled, artillery fire rates dropped, and mechanized elements found themselves unable to maneuver. Within days, the absence of resupply forced commanders into uncomfortable choices: hold positions without ammunition, withdraw under pressure, or abandon equipment altogether. Some units simply dissolved, not because they were defeated in combat, but because they could no longer function as organized forces. This outcome highlights a reality often overshadowed by dramatic frontline action. Territory can be lost and retaken, but logistics, once broken, take time to rebuild. A blocked road, a destroyed ammunition carrier, or a burning fuel truck can delay operations longer than the loss of a defensive position. In this case, the convoy's failure created a ripple effect that extended well beyond the strike zone. Russian recovery teams arrived late, worked under threat, and ultimately salvaged only a fraction of what was needed. The result was a temporary but decisive imbalance, where Ukrainian forces gained freedom of action while Russian units became reactive and constrained. The lesson is straightforward, but frequently ignored. Logistics are often the true center of gravity in modern warfare. Firepower wins engagements, but supply chains determine whether victories can be exploited or even sustained. The strike succeeded not because it destroyed everything in sight, but because it interrupted the flow that kept the front alive. If you value objective analysis over speculation and noise, consider following this channel. We focus on how decisions are made and the changes they produce, rather than just the moments that look dramatic on the surface. At the heart of this strike lies a deeper failure than lost vehicles or broken supply lines, a failure of doctrine. Russian planning treated safety as a fixed condition, something that could be achieved and then relied upon as long as the right equipment was present. The convoy moved under the assumption that air defense systems equaled protection, regardless of how those systems were positioned, supported, or integrated in real time. Once the boxes were checked, clear weather, escorts in place, route secured, the environment was judged safe. That assumption proved fatal, because safety in modern warfare is never static. It exists only moment by moment, and only until someone decides to challenge it. Ukrainian doctrine operated on the opposite premise. Nothing was considered permanently secure. Every movement, every formation, every time window was viewed as temporary and therefore exploitable. Instead of asking whether the convoy was protected, Ukrainian planners asked when that protection would be weakest. Instead of respecting the presence of air defenses, they analyzed how those defenses were used, how quickly they could react, and under what conditions they could be overwhelmed or bypassed. The result was a strike that did not rely on superior hardware, but on superior adaptation. This contrast reveals why advanced systems alone rarely guarantee success. Technology creates potential, but doctrine determines how that potential is realized. A convoy with powerful air defenses can still be vulnerable if those defenses are treated as insurance rather than tools that require constant management. By assuming safety, Russian commanders surrendered initiative. By assuming vulnerability, Ukrainian forces retained it. The outcome reinforces a recurring pattern in modern conflicts. Adaptive thinking consistently outperforms static planning, even when one side enjoys clear material advantages. Equipment can deter known threats, but it cannot anticipate creativity. In this case, the deadliest assumption was not that the convoy could not be attacked, but that it would not be. The strike exposed how quickly safe can become meaningless when an opponent refuses to accept the boundaries of doctrine and instead treats every moment as an opportunity to act. When you step back from the battlefield details, the deeper lessons of this story extend far beyond war. At its core, this analysis is not really about aircraft, missiles, or convoys. It is about how people think, decide, and adapt when circumstances are uncertain. One of the most important messages is that what feels safe is often just what feels familiar. In life, as in conflict, many failures begin when we assume stability where none truly exists. Routines, titles, savings, experience, or past success can quietly turn into blind spots if we stop questioning whether they still fit the world as it is today. Another lesson lies in timing. The decisive moments were not dramatic by themselves. They were brief, compressed, and easy to miss. Yet they shaped everything that followed. In everyday life, opportunities and risks often appear the same way, not announced loudly, not lasting long. The ability to recognize when a window is closing and to act with calm decisiveness rather than hesitation is a skill that grows more valuable with age, not less. Wisdom is not about rushing, but about knowing when waiting becomes the greater danger. There is also a powerful reminder about adaptability. Superior tools did not guarantee success for those who relied on them. What mattered was the willingness to adjust assumptions, learn continuously, and accept that conditions change faster than plans. For people navigating later stages of life, careers ending, roles shifting, health evolving, this lesson is deeply relevant. Strength often comes not from holding on, but from adjusting intelligently. Finally, the story underscores the importance of systems thinking. Problems rarely exist in isolation. Decisions ripple outward, affecting relationships, finances, families, and communities. Focusing only on visible outcomes can hide the real sources of long-term success or failure. Taken together, these lessons encourage a mindset grounded in awareness, humility, and thoughtful action. They remind us that experience is most valuable when paired with openness, and that staying mentally flexible may be one of the most powerful advantages we can carry forward at any stage of life.